Hello and welcome to Unstress and the Summer Series for 2021. What a year 2020 has been, and we have curated some episodes which we think were particularly relevant to what has been going on. I hope you're having a great break, looking forward to the new year and catching up then. Until then, hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, the topic of regenerative agriculture is one that our regular listeners would be very familiar with and know that I feel really passionate about that. I think it's really important that we understand not only where our food is coming from, but understand the differences in the way that food is produced. And that's why regenerative agriculture is such an important thing for us, I believe, all to be familiar with. I've heard it said recently that there are only 60 harvests left. 60 harvests left if we continue in this industrial agricultural way of going. And that's just unsustainable because I've got grandchildren and I think they're going to be around for a lot longer than 60 harvests. And I think we make the point that if nutrient-dense food is important for our health, then the way it's grown, who provides that, the soil in which that nutrient-dense food is grown is really important. So the story continues, and my guest today is somebody who I've been looking forward to talk to. I've heard of for many, many years, and I've been looking forward to talk to him. His name is Charlie Arnott. Now, the name Arnott is, of course, a very well-known name in Australia. Arnott's biscuits are very famous, and I have today in this episode resisted the temptation to talk to Charlie about those biscuits. My wife asked whether she could ask him about the Arnott's Monte Carlo, but no, I resisted that. There were far more important things to talk to Charlie about. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Charlie Arnott. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
Ron, lovely to be here.
Charlie, regenerative agriculture, holistic land management is a topic we've covered on this show many times, and we will continue to, and I've been looking forward to speaking to you for a long time. I wonder if you might share with our listener a little bit about your own story. What's brought you to this point?
Many things, really. I guess I grew up on a farm at Burrawa with my mum and dad and brother, and we farmed very conventionally from day one. And so that 1970, my family bought that property there, Hannah Minnow, and conventionally, by that I mean it was high input, high output farming. We had multiple enterprises. We had cattle and sheep. We did lots of cropping. We were growing wool. We were trading cattle and sheep. We had sort of multi-enterprises within each of those sort of sheep and cattle enterprises. So it was a very busy, intense, even though it was extensive farming on some thousands of acres. It was intense because of the amount of inputs we were using in that business. So, and I went away to school, went to university, and did a few other things. And when I came back to Burrawa, I farmed as my father had farmed and as I'd grown up to farm. And it was also reflective of the university degree I did, rural science at Arnott University. And so it was a very normal thing for me to be spraying everything all the time, pretty much. So it was a lot of chemical use on crops, on pasture, on cattle, in sheep, on sheep. That was part of our agronomic and our animal health regime. Very normal, and I didn't think anything else of it. That to me was a necessity. Only because that's all we'd ever done. Having said all that, though, Ron, I guess we were looking at other alternatives. We were, one of the first in the district to use a sort of a minimum till farming practice. We converted our gear so we could, get through stubble. There were sort of things we were looking at that were slightly outside the square, but still really in the conventional farming, industrial farming sort of realm. And then about 2004, 15 years ago, a series of pretty dry years. We were in the first few years of the millennial drought. We had been adjusting cattle all over the state, actually even into Queensland. We'd been feeding part of one of the, I guess the definition of a industrial farm or conventional farm. In my view is that there are parts of the year when you feed animals grain or fodder. Basically, that's a reflection of not working with nature and not following the natural cycles of nature. Again, that was reflective of the way we farmed. So, about 15 years ago, I had a sort of I went to a course. The real turning point for me was the day I went to a course, and it was called Profiting from the Drought.
Wow.
I read that.
Catchy title.
Yeah, read that. Catchy. It really caught my attention. I actually thought it was a bit of a joke because I thought profiting from the drought, like how is that possible? So I thought this would be a laugh. I went along to this one-day course put on by Resource Consulting Service Australia and Terry McCoskey. I know you know. It wasn't Terry who put it on the day, but it changed my life on that one day, and simply probably by the fact that it made me start questioning what I was doing, and because I hadn't to that point questioned that, because I guess in questioning what I was doing, I was actually questioning what Dad had done. And there's an interesting bit of psychology there about legacy and expectation and so on. So the minute I started questioning what I was doing, I didn't particularly like the answers that were coming up. I either didn't have the answers or they were quite confronting. Why was I waking up every morning killing things? Why wasn't I working with nature? Was I really happy? That was probably the biggest question that the facilitator, Sean Martin, asked me on the way to the bakery to get a pie at lunch. He said, yeah, but that's all fine, but are you happy? And I said to him, look, well, I'm not unhappy, which is a pretty poor sort of answer. So I guess, Ron, that one-day course and then the subsequent one-week course called Grazing for Profit were the turning points for me, because it really opened my eyes up to a whole way of thinking, a different way of thinking. It was busting paradigms. I mean, that whole week was, my head was exploding with excitement, but that was also mixed with, feelings of guilt, feelings of I guess, fear and loathing, the fear of change. I knew you can't unknow this stuff once you start learning it. Like this means I'm going to have to change what I do. And I literally, halfway through that course on day 3 or 4, I rang the guys at home, my station hands at home, and I said, as an example, I said, put all those mobs together. We don't want to keep our cattle and our sheep, all separate now. We want to put all those sheep together. There's no reason why we're keeping them separate, just as an example. So it was an immediate, it was a big turning point. As Charlie Massey says, it was a tension event. And a number of tension events that led to that point. So I guess that's where I started my journey, my regenerative journey, Ron, as I like to call it. Not that word was even really used back then, but it really made me think about, what sort of job I was doing. I didn't really question whether I wanted to be a farmer. It was really questioning what sort of a farmer did I want to be. And I didn't really like what I was seeing when I really looked in the mirror. So look, over some years, I met many wonderful people in the regenerative agriculture space, in the holistic farm management space, even slightly outside of that. People like Dr. Patrick McManaway, who is a lovely man who he teaches and he facilitates and he goes around the world literally. Talking to people about subtle energies. That's another whole realm of agriculture that Terry McCoskey is very much into, that we don't, we're just not really tapping into as much as we could. So, look, the journey's been, and it's been amazing, and it's getting faster. Like, there's more stuff happening, there's more information out there, there's more people joining this sort of movement, I guess you'd call it, and it's really exciting. So that's how I got to be where I am. There's lots of little stories, little few diversions and distractions, Ron.
Sure.
But
I'm sure. But that's a relatively short, given the family history of farming. And okay, 1970, it's not like you went back into the 1800s or anything, but still, 30, 40 years of farming is a family history there. And people, I guess this is actually a bigger question, isn't it, about why people resist change, because so often they see it as a rejection of the past and all that the past represents. And that's quite confronting, isn't it?
It's very confronting, and I think that's probably the biggest hurdle. One of the biggest hurdles I had, and also, one of the biggest hurdles that most people probably have in farming, that hurdle in farming, it's not unique just to farming, I'm sure, but I guess because of the nature of farming, that our lives and our livelihoods and our lifestyles are so intrinsically linked to our jobs. We live in our homes, and our homes are on farm. We can't escape work. So when we are exposed to different things, and there's the opportunity or possibility of change, that change is potentially a ripple effect through your whole life. So it is a big thing. And as I say to people, the first. In the world of farming, once we identify we need to change some things, or we think there's, that we're looking at other opportunities and possibilities, it's really important to change the paddock between your ears first. That's the place you've got to get that right. Not so much right, you've just got to start changing the landscape of your thinking, really before, we have that sort of enough confidence or enough sort of motivation or impetus to then change the landscape, the way we manage our landscape, in our actual paddocks. And I think that's an important distinction, because, I didn't necessarily do that. I had tools in my hand, and it was, knowledge is tools, and I went out with some of that knowledge, and I hadn't really changed not fully changed the way that my expectations of how to use those tools and what outcomes I was looking for. So I really buggered things up in a big way. Some things, my grazing management, I thought I knew what I was doing, and I really flogged out some paddocks because I just didn't get the timing right, or there's lots of reasons. But I don't regret those things, Ron, because they're the things that really they're the lessons I learned, and they were hard lessons, but, the sort of a tool in the hand of an ignorant person or someone without the skills to use it can be a very dangerous thing. And I'm not suggesting that people have to be wary or cautious of, the practices of regenerative farming. I'm just saying that, it's important to sort of understand why you're going to use those tools and getting a feel for how to use them. But, to work on the mindset first is critical, I'd suggest.
And yet, so many people on the land have a long history with it, don't they? And not a long family history, a long history of how things were done. And I can just imagine how difficult that transition is. And interestingly, the person asking you, "Are you happy?" What an interesting question, to start the conversation with. Are you happy? Because mental health in our world, not just in the farming world, mental health in our world is a pretty serious issue. But on the land and the stresses that the land throws up at you, it's a really big issue.
It totally is, and that question is not something that I don't think people ask themselves that enough. I mean, when you ask the question why to anyone about anything, and they give you an answer, and then you ask them why, the three whys. I mean, 9 times out of 10, the final why is because I want to be happy. Everything we do leads to that point of wanting to be happy and fulfilled. Success, happiness, fulfillment. So, and to your point about sort of the pressures of and legacy of farming, the course. It's a good point, because the course I did and the subsequent training I did with RCS and the sort of the friendships I developed and the network of farmers that I was involved in for some years. One of my good friends that was on a business board. So through that process, you create business boards of 6 or 7 different businesses, and there might be a husband or wife, representing a business. and you come together every 4 months at a conference for a couple of days, and you really get down to tin tacks. You turn up to these things and you have an hour or so to work on your business, throughout this conference in this sort of board sort of situation. It's confidential. And you turn up there looking to talk about, I want to talk about my plumbing or my fencing or something. Anyway, you get hammered because everybody goes, nah, mate, you're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about your marriage or your depression or your anxiety or something. Like, it's really it's a really safe environment, and I so support anyone who's thinking about that type of network or engaging. But my point is, one of those members of the board, his family had been on their property for 6 generations. I think it was 6 generations. I mean, the name of the property was the family name, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so, he was part of our business board. We talked about farming for the first year and a half or so. And then through the process of just essentially asking, are you happy? What's going on in your world? And stepping out of the day-to-day drudgery of farming and really looking down at what he was doing and why, one day he turned up on his knees and just said, I'm going to sell the property. I don't think I want to be a farmer anymore.
Wow.
It was fast. It was, and that's not a bad thing, and I think there are a lot of farmers who are farming because of expectation, you know, and that's fine, but there's consequences for that. And this particular guy, very courageous man to be doing that, and he made the decision because of the training he had done and the his self-development. He decided to leave. So, I mean, don't know how rare that is. I do know that one of the criticisms of this type of training is people say, see, he sold his farm, he failed. That stuff doesn't work. This holistic farm management stuff doesn't work because he sold his farm. I mean, truth be known, there are a number of farmers that sell their farms because they actually, through this training, work out, I don't want to be a farmer. I'm only doing it because Dad wanted me to. And so it's a really good question you ask, because there is that pressure. It's the elephant in the room in a lot of family situations, and succession in farming families in Australia, and I probably dare say other parts of the world, is that can be and often is a disaster because there's this expectation, and there's and often farmers, when they're talking about this stuff, they're not in a good mental state anyway. It's often in a drought situation where mum and dad are going, things are getting tough, understandably. We're thinking about getting out of here. And the family's going, oh, my God, like, really? You want us to take this over? Or I want all of this and my sister and brother can't have any? I mean, it's just there's never a good time for it. But if you can, you need to get onto it. This is, I guess, I'm not giving any advice. It's just my experience was very good, I have to say, But I know plenty of families who have really suffered and struggled with that whole process, and more often than not, it doesn't end well.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought was interesting with your story just now is you talked about your background with your degree, where you had all these inputs and outputs and agronomics, and you understood what was what, and you're kind of buying into a system that makes you actually very vulnerable, doesn't it? I mean, if we're talking about happiness and fulfillment in life, the word vulnerability doesn't figure high when people are talking, I'm really happy, but gee, I'm vulnerable. I don't think those two words go very well together, do they?
Well, I mean, I like the idea of personal vulnerability because that can be a very good thing. But when a business is vulnerable, that's not a good position to be in. And the current, industrial farming, conventional farming model is a fantastic business model for everyone but the farmer. Because at the end of the day, the farmer is propping up so many businesses, whether it's the person who supplies the fertiliser or the chemical or is carting the animals or whatever. I mean, there are some costs, of course, in any farm business that you can't escape, and that's we know that. But this high input and yes, high output, and that's a whole other point. But the high input farming, which is, as you say, is reliant. You're vulnerable to the whims and of the market. The cost of chemical, the cost of fodder. People who are buying hay and grain, you are really dealing with, you're stacking a whole lot of variables in your business that are not in your control, and you're trying to control them or you're trying to deal with them. And that's, again, I guess, back to that Grazing for Profit course I did, Ron. One of the things that was very clear to me, and one of the lessons I learned, was that, focus on what's in your control. And because as farmers, we spend so much time dealing with things out of our control, but we don't just deal with them, we focus on them so much. And, if we can reallocate our time to be focusing on the things in our control, I think, our businesses would be a lot further ahead. But, yeah, look, that they call it a chemical cycle or industrial farming cycle. I was stuck in that, absolutely, and had our family farm had been doing that for, 35 years.
It's interesting to hear you say that it's a great economic model for everyone but the farmer, because I actually also reflect on healthcare, saying that our current health system is a brilliant economic model. It's literally fed by the chemical and the food industry. It's managed by the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry. So it's a great economic model. It's just not a very good health model.
Aren't there more medicos like you in the world?
But listen, I wrote this down, profiting for the drought. That would attract my attention in this environment. What's happening out there, Charlie? We hear a lot about the drought in the city, and a lot of my podcast is really, I hope, bringing people's attention in the city to the farm, to what's happening on the land, because it's just so critical for so many reasons. But tell us what's going on out there, because Australia is going through a very bad drought in Eastern Australia.
Yeah, things aren't too bad in Victoria at the moment, which is great for a couple of reasons. One, at least someone's having a good year, and two, it represents a strong market for people in the north of Victoria to be selling some stock into. So that's a lovely thing. Look, what's happening? There's a lot happening. I guess to summarise it, what I see this, in terms of the evolution of farming, this is a tipping point. It's a tension event that a lot of farmers are going through. It's essentially an opportunity, I think, for farmers to, stand back and look at what they're doing. And I'm not saying anyone's doing anything bad. I'm just saying that, and from my personal experience, I got to a point where I was questioning what I was doing, and I was looking for answers, right? And this is a really good time for farmers in any state, state or situation, to be questioning what they're doing. Do I want to? Because a drought's going to happen again, Ron, isn't it? Like another 3 years, it'll be. Victoria might be in a drought in 2 years' time. Yep. So these are things we can't escape. So I guess the opportunity for farmers to look at other options if they're not happy with what they're doing, if they're sick of, their mortgage getting bigger, their overdraft getting bigger, their cattle getting skinnier, their grass not being there anymore, and the constant battle with nature, start considering what they're doing. So I guess that's what's happening. That's the opportunity that this current situation presents, and it's really scary. We in terms of the state of the eastern seaboard and the environment and the season, we at Burrawa, and I dare say this is reflective of a lot of the eastern states, it looks like February. We're at the end of November, and if you took a photo of when I have been of our place at the moment, it looks like the end of summer. We're at the wrong end of summer to be having this sort of weather. And so we've had about 20% of the rainfall we would normally have to this point from July, August, September, October this financial year. So we are absolutely in uncharted territory.
And where is Burrawa for our listener? Where is it's in New South Wales, but
Burrawa is in New South Wales. It's about an hour and a half north of Canberra, or 4 hours sort of down the Hume Highway, 3 hours down the Hume Highway from Sydney, and then sort of half an hour north of there. So it's southwest slopes of New South Wales. Yeah. And Burrawa is considered, along with sort of Cootamundra and, Orange maybe, and that sort of part of the world, as a reasonably safe area. We tend to go into droughts, later than most, and we sort of come out of droughts earlier. So there's sort of it's safer than a lot of parts of the state. But no, we haven't. We've played catch up in the last month or two. Having said all that, Ron, too, there are places in Western New South Wales and Queensland that have been in a drought for 7 years.
Wow, that's just mind-boggling,
isn't it?
It's mind-boggling.
Just, these places. Yeah,
Can you drought? We're going to talk. I'm wanting to. It's just I have had Tim Wright on the show too, and I had the pleasure of going up to Tim Wright's property when we did some work with the Southern New England Land Care, and I mentioned that on one side of the road was, and this was in February, March of this year, it was desolate. It was dust. There were a couple of cattle grazing somewhere on the horizon, and across the road in exactly the same environment was Tim's property, which did have vegetation on it. He had destocked. He said it was the worst drought he'd ever seen, and that was back then. I can hardly imagine what he's thinking now, but at least there was vegetation on the property. Can you drought-proof property?
It's a good question, Ron. I guess. A drought to me is man-made. And when I say that, I mean, what does someone look out the window and see when they're in drought? They see no feed, and they see no, that's essentially the biggest sign of a drought. Obviously, there's no feed because it hasn't rained and it hasn't grown, and there's other complications with water and so on. But, case in point, Tim, the New England has been in a drought on and off for some years. It has, it might have a reasonable autumn and then it have a terrible winter and spring. And over the road, you've got someone to look over there to say, look, that's in a drought situation. But you turn around and there's someone, that's not actually in a drought. So decisions create droughts. The decision to hang on to stock when they're eating all your grass, and you then might decide to feed them hay. That's a decision where you're going to owe the bank more money. You're going to owe your ecological bank money as well, because you're basically mining those paddocks. So back to your question, can you drought proof a property? Well, yeah, you can. It's all about decision making. So the thing to do that is with your brain. You make decisions that are based on. It's really based on changing your decision-making process. And what is that? Well, how does one make decisions? Well, you need two things to make a decision. You need data, you need numbers. In a situation like a drought, how many cattle have I got on, how much feed do I have, how much time do I have, how much money I've got in the bank, how much, what's my mental state? Hard to put a number on that, but that's the data you need. And then the second thing you need is goals. Mm-hmm. You need some goals, because the goals guide the decision and the use of those resources and the use of that data to then help you make a decision. So, if you're a farmer and you're not thinking about, if one of your goals is not to retain ground cover, or one of your goals is doesn't relate to taking care of your ecological bank account, then you're going to make decisions which are going to probably mean you're going to keep your cattle on, which means you're going to have to feed them, which means that you're going to be spending money, which means you're probably going to be, not doing the best job in your landscape. So, and what's the outcome of that? Well, it looks like a drought situation. Yeah. So, there's lots of, I trust that's a reasonably simple explanation of that. There's so many different nuances to that whole concept, but really, and having said all that, you're in the Western Division of New South Wales, 7 years of no rain. Well, your sort of decision making drops out of the equation. 3 years in, you just got to, go on holiday. Yeah. Hope for the best.
Yeah. Another great guest and another great book that I've read is Charlie Massey's book, The Call of the Reed Warbler. And you've kind of made reference to what's going on between your ears as being a very important part, and Charlie refers to that as the human social cycle. And yes. But he also refers to those 4 other cycles, which are pretty important, and I'm guessing would play a role in that drought proofing of a land.
That's right. So you've got the solar the solar and the water and the mineral and the biological is the easiest way I sort of put them together, those other four. So in a grazing situation, you want to maximise the number of solar panels you have to capture solar light, and that means keeping grass. And obviously that grass has to be alive to be a functional solar panel. But again, that's out of our control. We can't make it rain. But what we can focus on, is making sure we have ground cover to retain that rain. So that leads us to the second cycle, which is the water cycle. So how do we keep or maintain a healthy water cycle? Well, the best water cycle is one where it involves a plant and it involves soil. So we want that rain to fall and stay in the one spot. We don't necessarily want that hitting the ground and going sideways into a creek or a dam or a river. Or
and taking soil with it.
Taking soil, taking nutrients, taking the, one of our jobs as farmers is, I call myself a soil builder. So exactly right. When that water is going sideways, not being drunk by a plant, and it's removing a precious resource. Again, that's a decision-making thing. When there's no grass there. So we've got our solar and our water cycle, and of course there's the how do we maintain the mineral cycle? Well, we need to have healthy plants in that soil and growing. Plants make soil, and soil grows plants. That's the distinction. It's the activity of a plant in soil pumping carbon and sugars essentially into the ground that feeds the bugs, that then allows those bugs and those fungus to gather and, firstly they communicate, and then there's this transaction of sugars, and in return for the sugars, the soil biota feeds the plant what it needs. There's a communication stream. There's a highway of minerals and enzymes and sugars and communication that takes place under our feet. So that's sort of the and that involves the mineral cycle, because that's what the fungus are basically translocating to get to the plant.
Because and Charlie, we've had a pretty adversarial approach to those microbes in the soil, like we have in our own bodies for a long time, haven't we? Like we're preoccupied in health. Yeah.
That's right.
We're preoccupied in health with making everything antiseptic, get rid of bugs. But in healthcare, we're learning how important they are. I guess we're learning that in agriculture too.
Yes, slowly, Ron, absolutely. And as well as anyone that the soil biology is very similar to gut biology. The interactions that take place, the movement, the balance of the fungus and the bacteria, and that's the plant's stomach is essentially outside of its body. It is the soil. That's where all these processes take place. Just like our stomach is obviously internal and it's a contained unit, but there's very similar activities taking place. There's digestion, and there's translocation, and there's passing across membranes, the whole thing. So
I love that, Charlie. The plant's stomach is outside the plant. That's a beauty.
It's external.
Yeah.
I don't know that they might be my words are strung together, but it's not necessarily my concept. But I love it because it builds the relationship between. I mean, there is such a strong relationship between. They're very reflective of each other. The soil of the stomach of a plant, the stomach of an animal, a mammal, and so and they obviously have the same function. So, and then therein lies, I guess the crux of the matter, isn't it? That it's the digestion that takes place in that soil that produces the plant and the flowers and the fruit and so on, and which stimulates the health of the soil. That essentially produces the food that we then digest in our stomach. So the health, it's not a long bow to draw that the health of the soil is directly related to, or the health of us is directly related to the health of the soil where we're actually sourcing our food from.
Yeah. I mean, you can even draw the analogy a little bit further by saying you can keep a person alive on an intravenous drip, giving them saline and sugar, and keep them going for quite a long time. But you really want them to be having a nutrient-dense diet, to be thriving and healthy. And similarly, plants can grow with superphosphate.
Yeah.
But without their digestive system working, I like this, Charlie. I actually like that analogy.
Well, how's this one? How about hydroponic people? That's what we've basically got, you know. You think about hydroponic tomatoes, let's just say. So, you're probably aware that, roots on plants, there's quite a few different types of roots, but there's the ones that are essentially used to draw water up into the plant, and there's ones that are doing more of the communication with the soil biology and drawing nutrients up. So when you have a water soluble fertilizer, and that could be in soil, so it could be urea, it could be superphosphate, it could be lots of water soluble minerals and so on, artificial as they were. We're basically pumping up those plants are drawing up those minerals through their water roots, let's just call them, and so they're basically being force fed. Right? That's far from a natural process. The extreme of that is a hydroponic situation where that's all there is. There's not even soil particles or fungus or bacteria. It is just simply water soluble nutrients being force fed into these tomatoes. So back to your point, yes, a human could survive on the very basics. What a life that would be. But yes, its life could be supported. But that'd be no fun. And it's and then the eating of food that's grown in the same way, hydroponics or whatever, it's just not nutritionally dense, and it's not natural, and there's just not that balance of all the good stuff. Well, we need. Plants have an intelligence, and they know what we need if we just tell them, and there's a number of ways we can do that. But once we understand and we acknowledge and we actually work with that function of nature, then we'll be a much healthier and happier race of people.
You said, imagine humans being like hydroponics. Imagine what a life that would be. Well, I'm not sure we have to imagine too much, Charlie, because, a lot of that's what's going on. And then there was that fourth cycle of diversity, isn't it? Or biodiversity.
Absolutely. Yeah, biodiversity. So we have, essentially the living component of that. So we've already talked about the plants, but there's there's nowhere on Earth where there's not the activity or the relationship between plants and animals. And I was in Italy for a couple of months in the middle of the year, just gone, and it was fascinating because they grow a lot of food there. It's part of their culture, but there were not many animals in the landscape. There were not many cattle. Every farm used to have cattle, and they live underneath in their villas, and that would be where the cattle and the pigs and the sheep and whatever. In 2 months, I saw 2 mobs of cattle.
Wow.
And that was fascinating because, I think that's the bit that's really missing over there, and probably in lots of other parts of the world, is the function and the relationship the animals have with the landscape in terms of the cycling of nutrients, the disturbance, and the roles they play in so many of those cycles we were just talking about. The solar cycle, for example, plants, when they're grazed by animals, it stimulates sugars to be pumped into the ground so they can recover. They're putting up fresh, much more effective solar panels when they do that. So, the diversity or biodiversity of the landscape, whether it be in someone's back garden or, a million acres in the territory, is absolutely critical because it's also it's part of the immune system of that environment, isn't it? The more creatures literally you have in that environment, the more resilient it is, the more adaptable it is to seasonal variations and fluctuations, and the more adaptable it is to the good old human who comes along wanting to trash it. We're really good at that. And nature is just so forgiving, and it's more forgiving with the greater number of species, flora and fauna it has, to deal with good old humans coming along trying to trash it. And of course that also relates to the soil and the whole biology of the soil. So
I remember Terry McCosker saying to me, and I still remember him, he was saying on the show, and he said, "Ron, ruminant urine is a beautiful thing." It's a beautiful thing, Ron. And I said, oh, Terry, please do share that with me and my listener. And he said, well, it's got plant growth hormone in it. Ruminant urine has plant growth hormone in it, and that stimulates a healthy plant, which is more or less what you just said. And yet, that's a classic, isn't it? And then he actually went on to say, now, hang on, Pseudomonas syringae is a microbe in the soil which floats up into the atmosphere and seeds rain. Oh, my God, what a concept that is. But listen, animals have come in for copped a bit of a copping a hiding, aren't they, in this world of agriculture and food and health and this whole movement towards vegans. And I kind of, I kind of agree with one undeniable fact, and that is industrial animal agriculture is a cruel and what's bad for the animal is bad for us, and what's bad for us and the animal is bad for the planet. But there is another way, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a good point, Ron, and I think that those who are not keen on the animals being eaten is generally an environmental or a nutritional or an ethical angle, and that's fine. That's the argument, and so it's. I mean, to me, at the end of the day, ruminants and animals are necessary. I'll start again. If we take it right back to what is one of the biggest problems that vegans have, for instance, with animals being in the landscape? Well, they say, and the story is that they tell us is that the ruminants are ruining the planet. That the methane and the gases, the greenhouse gases that they're producing, is actually increasing carbon levels in the atmosphere, which is causing, leading us to climate change. And it's an interesting one because they are producing methane, absolutely. But when you stand back and you go, what else? What's been happening for the last sort of some thousands of years? In North America, for instance, there used to be some hundreds of millions of bison, right? And they're bovine, and they were producing a whole lot of methane. Methane lasts in the atmosphere about 11 to 13 years. So every 13 years, all the methane that was produced 13 years ago is no longer there. So there's as long as the number of animals in an environment or in the world over that 13-year period stays the same, we're not actually producing more methane. Another interesting thing is that and I heard this on a Joel Salatin podcast the other day, if you've got grass that is sitting there, if it gets eaten by a ruminant, a result of that is methane production. If that grass is sitting there and doesn't get eaten by a ruminant and it decomposes, it still emits the same amount of methane. Okay, there's two interesting points. Back to your point about the type of meat, it's a pity, I guess, and it's disappointing, for want of a better word, that the argument is always around just meat. And to your point, there's industrially farmed factory meat, and absolutely that is a contributor to greenhouse gas in a number of different ways because it's much more intensive. We're burning a lot more fossil fuels to produce the crops that are fed to the animals, in whether it's in a hen house, farm factory situation or a feedlot. And the quality of the meat, that's stepping into the nutritional angle, that's a whole other thing that I'm sure you're aware of too. So it's really a matter of, when I occasionally have discussions with people who aren't really supportive of what I do, I ask them, well, when you say meat is bad, like what are we talking about? What sort of meat? And you sort of start asking them questions and stepping them through that. And once they understand, once it's highlighted that not more meat is the same, and you put on the table that ruminants, the number of ruminants in North America, for instance, are exactly the same. Well, not exactly, but are very similar to the number of ruminants who were there 250 years ago, and we're producing the same amount of methane, it really starts changing pulling apart their argument from an environmental point of view that we're producing more methane and we're ruining the planet. I mean, to step, even further down that argument, Ron, I mean, my view is we need ruminants in the landscape to sequester carbon by eating grass, pump and supporting and encouraging and actually making those plants pump sugar into the ground, we're actually sequestering carbon. So this whole regenerative ag world is the most effective way to save the planet. If we all agree that there's some carbon in the atmosphere we want to put in the ground, and we want to sort of reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, regenerative practices do that because a lot of them use animals. And when you're using animals, you are actually sequestering carbon. And those who are doing regenerative practices are generally not having as much input, so they're burning less fossil fuel. There's less transportation of stuff. So there's a less emission of carbon, and there's an enhanced sequestration of carbon. Now that's a win-win.
Yeah.
And as I say to people, if we can agree on that, we can call this a biological problem, right? The carbon being put in the atmosphere is a biological. Fossil fuels is essentially biology. We're burning it; it's going to the atmosphere. The only solution to do it to change that around is by using biology. Using technology, using mechanics, using chemistry, even using physics. I don't believe are as effective as actually looking at the problem and going, if biology was the thing that sort of created it, or us burning the biology in the first place, let's get that biology back on the ground. Let's use biology to sequester.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think if we cast our mind back to first year high school, or year 7, I think it's called now. High school.
That wasn't very long ago for either of us, right?
I have to dig deep there, Charlie. I have to dig very deep. But anyway, we did learn about photosynthesis. It was one of the first things high school students learn in biology is photosynthesis. And it doesn't get much more complicated than that when we're talking about sequestering carbon, does it?
That's right. I mean, as was highlighted to me the other day by a fellow, Aaron McKenzie. Who,
know Aaron very well.
Aaron? Yes,
very, very well.
Really well. Good. Well, he said it really well the other day. He said that, animals and the soil is essentially the best, what was the word he used, solar battery that we have.
Yep.
We're basically capturing solar energy via plants and good soil and turning that into, protein, animals, fat. And in that process, we're putting carbon, essentially solar energy, as it were, into the ground. We're capturing that. So I think that was a fascinating sort of way to look at it. That there's so many benefits of, I think, and many people would support this. There's so many benefits of this whole concept of using animals in a landscape to graze, pasture, to produce food, to sequester carbon. There is no food shortage on the planet.
No, we've established that.
It's a distribution problem. And what a wonderful thing that in the process of sequestering carbon and reducing emissions of carbon in that sort of process, in that sort of a business, we're actually producing more nutrient dense food.
No, it's and that, which kind of another thing I wanted to ask you, because I know you're very familiar with the word biodynamic. We hear that a lot. What does that mean?
Oh, Ron, how much time you got? Look, I was introduced to biodynamics through the RCS program. I met at one of the conferences. I met a fellow called Hamish Mackay, who's been doing, he was introduced to biodynamics in his 20s. He's been doing that for 45 years now. He's been teaching. His family farm was using biodynamics for many years. So I guess when I was introduced to Hamish and I heard him speak, what he spoke about resonated with me. It was at a time when I was very open to all sorts of different concepts. I knew I had to really be open to new things, and I was at that sort of a hungry stage of personal development. And so when he talked about biodynamics and the use of biodynamics in a landscape, in a farm, it resonated with me because it sort of seemed to put a lot of structure around and answered quite a few questions around nature and how it worked and how we could actually have a relationship with nature, as opposed to getting out of bed every morning and going, essentially, how am I going to battle and fight and in lots of cases kill nature to get done what had to be done as a farmer. So I guess that was the attraction to me, that it really represented an alternative to what I've already been doing. And essentially it involves the use of a number of preparations. And a lot of these preparations are made, well, they're all made with natural ingredients, and a number of them are based around using cow manure, okay, which is in, plentiful supply at Hanamino, our farm, a lot of farms. And a number of the things we do with that is the sort of, I guess, the showpiece biodynamic preparation is cow horn manure 500, which is essentially putting lactating cow manure in a cow horn and put that in the ground over winter for 6 months. So the horn is a perfect vessel to be putting cow manure into, or any sort of compostable material, and putting that in the ground. So we use cow manure because the cow is one of the three, I guess, pinnacle species on the planet. And I'm talking about the worm is essentially the archetype species, I guess, of the soil. It's such an important species, animal there. Mm-hmm. In the air, we have the bee, right? And the bee, we know all about the bee. If the bee's not around, we're in strife. Such a significant role to play in production of food. And the cow, representing sort of ruminants, I guess, is, ruminants essentially created all the grasslands on the planet, which created soil, which created not just microclimates but macroclimates. So the grazing animals of the world, essentially that's what the cow represents. And so we use a cow and the cow manure because of one of the reasons is the energy she puts into that grass that she's chewing and cutting in her rumen. There's a lot of intense energy that's put into that. A lot of effort, a lot of intention, as it were. And when that comes out the other end, it's the perfect fertilizer. Okay. We've turned the biology of the grass, which is representative of the landscape, into a compostable and fermented product, which is the store and the source of the biology we really need to get back out into that landscape to heal it. Mm-hmm. So we're using cow manure in a horn. Another one we use is another preparation is something called cow manure concentrate. Again, it's cow manure. We put that into a cement mixer. We throw some eggshell and some basalt dust into that, and we mix it for an hour. And we put that in the ground in a pit. It could be 2 foot deep and sort of the size of a Hessian bag. And in there we put the 6 compost preparations, the biodynamic compost preparations. And those 6 herbs we use. We put that into the manure. And we're essentially inserting organs of organic agriculture into that manure. It's like you could just put that manure in the ground and it would compost and it'd be amazing. But the function and the role of these herbs in that manure in the ground, it's like the organs of our body. Mm-hmm. Okay, each organ of our body has a function in that entity in the human body or any animal. And when we take one out or we don't have them there in the first place, our body tends not to work as well as it potentially could. Okay, it's the same as a compost heap. When we insert these essentially an organisational structure into the compost heap, we're supercharging it. We're creating almost like a living body of decomposition, a living entity which, look, at the end of the day, we supercharge that compost. And then we use that compost once it's made after 4 months, in the case of this cow manure concentrate. We then spread that on the landscape in a diluted form. We're using quantities of 150 grams a hectare. Very cheap, very low
low inputs.
Impact, low inputs, and then we're using the resources that we have around us. And look, there's a whole lot sort of, I guess, Ron, more cosmic element to biodynamics, which we can go to at another time. But it's for me, it's a wonderful practice because it also creates some ritual around the farm. You know, there are certain times of the year we do these things. You know, we have real reverence it creates some real reverence around the engagement with nature. You know, we're using resources, we're giving back. You know, we're not having to go to the shops and buy bags of stuff to give back to the landscape.
Something I heard Charlie Massey say, which really resonated with me, is that rather than dominate nature, we should enable it. And it seems like you in your life as a farmer have experienced the entire continuum, from your high input agronomic beginnings with your university degree to your epiphany of regenerative agriculture, and in that continuum of enabling nature, biodynamic is the next step, particularly when, I guess, if we went into subtle energy, and we haven't got time to discuss that now, but I'm guessing that's the continuum, isn't it, that you've kind of experienced, almost the length and breadth of it.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting way to put it, Ron. I guess I'm if I can say this, well positioned because I can have conversations with farmers, conventional farmers, and about the trials and tribulations of using chemical and fertiliser and sort of the pros and cons of that sort of thing, and all the way to the other end of the scale, as you say, about subtle energy and the bit more spooky wah-wah sort of.
Well, the rituals around, I think rituals are an important part of our human experience. In a certain extent, we've lost them in our modern society.
Well, that's a good point, Ron, and you're a good interviewer, aren't you? You're always coming up with those little gems. It's good. It's good.
Leave a review on the podcast, Charlie. As
an interviewee, I'm your favourite. You're my favourite. But you're right. I mean, that's something that we. You know, my current rituals revolved around making phone calls to agronomists to buy more superphosphate or something. You know, that was the thing in the diary and the calendar, and I would, if it was me or someone else, go and spread that, and that was the ritual. You know, I wasn't giving back to the land. I was really, I was using it. You know, my attitude was this landscape is a resource I'm going to use to do what I need to do, and so having the ritual and the reverence, which I guess any good ritual has a reverence for the process and the activity, and having a healthy respect for what nature's trying to do. And nature's always trying to move to a state of more of complexity. So when we allow it to do that, we allow it to self-organise. And getting back to that conversation around biodiversity, you have the more people you have on your team, the more animals, the more biology you have on your team, the more chance that you have someone who's going to come in and do the job that needs to be done, as opposed to calling your agronomist and saying, I need a job done, can I get some more urea, which in itself creates a whole lot more problems. So, look, it's been an interesting journey, Ron.
Yeah. Charlie, if you had to, we're going to finish up, and I just wanted to ask if you had a message for people in the city, because I'm really wanting to connect people in the city with what is happening out in the country. Well, what sort of advice would you give people in the city as part of that human social cycle that could make a difference?
Well, look, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say so, because that is probably the most important, and Charlie does say that in the book, that the social, because it's humans in nature that are making the decisions, and it's not just humans on farm, it's humans in the city with their food buying choices and their behaviour. So if I could suggest to anyone, I ask people, do they have a doctor? And they generally say, yes, I've got a doctor, and I say, how often do you see your doctor? And they go, once every 6 months or so. And are they important to your health regime? Of course they are. They're a doctor, And then I say, who's your farmer? And they look at me like I've got two heads, and they go, what do you mean? I said, well, how often do you need a farmer? Oh, I don't know, 3 times a day. It's like there. And so why don't you have a farmer? Why don't we have farmers? So my suggestion to people is, if we had farmers and if we engaged with farmers and we went on farm, we bought their food and we we understood a little bit more about the practice of farming and the things they're going through, and the processes, the production, and their relationship with nature and so on, we're going to be much better off. And we probably won't need to see our doctor as often, because if we're eating nutritious food direct from the farmer and having a relationship with them, a social connection, which we all used to many, many, many years ago. Everyone was either, if not a farmer, had a cousin or a brother or a sister or something. So I'd also suggest, because there's the images we see on the news, the pleas for help, that's helpful when there's support given to organisations that are supporting farmers to adopt and take up long-term solutions to this problem. Okay, let's just say it's the drought, this extended dry period. I understand the benefit of hay being bought and people paying for hay, and that given to farmers to get through through something, but what we need is long-term solutions. And if people are going to charities, donate to charities like Carbonate, for instance, where you're actually helping reward farmers for sequestering carbon, and you're helping, and also the charity Thankful for Farmers. Yep. Get online and check them out, because they're partnering with brands, and the sale of those particular products that those brands produce goes to a fund, and that fund will be distributed to farmers who are and initiatives that are building the health and the well-being of rural communities, the adoption of technology, and long-term practices. So our motto is essentially, we're not into giving people fish. We want to give them a fishing rod and show them how to use it, and then you just, you get on with it, because there's going to be another drought. And we want farmers to get to the next drought prepared. Your friend and mine, Terry McCosker, Ron, he says, as a farmer, we're always doing one of three things. We're either getting out of a drought, preparing for a drought, or moving into a drought. So, we've always got to be. Actually, I might bugger that up. We're either in a drought, recovering from a drought, or preparing for a drought. So we're always dealing with the threat of a drought. And when we have long-term strategies, such as the ones that Terry teaches, and organisations like Thankful for Farmers is supporting, that's going to make a real difference. So any city folks out there, buy good, clean food, get to know your farmer, and support charities like Thankful for Farmers and Carbonate.
Great. Charlie, what a great note to finish on, and thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge, wisdom, experience with our listener. Thank you. And we'll have links to all of those too.
Wonderful. Oh, Ron, I've had so much fun, and thank you for the work you're doing, because as I sincerely meant that before, why aren't there more people like you in the medical space? Because I wrote a piece that was in the Good Food magazine a couple of weeks ago, and I
saw it.
Opened with, if I was the Prime Minister of, I'd join the Ag and the Health Departments. Well, you could be my first minister,
mate. I think they call it retweeted. I don't know. I'm just getting my head around social media, but I saw that article and I could not agree with you more. And anyway, thanks for today.
No worries, Ron. Had a blast. Thank you very much.
Well, as I said, there was so much in that episode, and there was so many amazing things that we talked about, and I just think I loved some of what Charlie was saying. The plant's stomach outside of the plant the plant's stomach is outside of the plant in the form of the microbes in the soil, which break the nutrients down and make it available for the plant. Now, another episode you may recall, I said a healthy teaspoon of soil contains about 1 billion microbes in a healthy teaspoon of soil. The role of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil are really important. We've talked about that on other podcasts. And just to remind you, a healthy cubic metre of soil has hyphae, which are those fine extensions that fungi put out. A healthy cubic metre of soil contains 40 kilometres of hyphae. So you can see how this microbial fungi community could break nutrients down in the soil and make them available to the plant. And this idea that the plant is on life support system, if you like, when it's fed superphosphate and all the chemicals. But if we generate healthy soil, then we get the full gamut of elements that are available to a plant, which is fed to an animal, which is fed to us, and which we then eat. And so this is what nutrient-dense means. So I loved also this idea of enabling or dominating nature. And there is just so much more that I'd love to talk to Charlie, and I always feel compelled, as I did when I spoke to Terry McCosker, of going down and doing this 7-day course that Terry does, and the Biodynamic course that Charlie does as well. And I'm going to have links to Charlie's website and those courses and a whole range of other things that he mentioned, the Carbonate charity and the Thankful for Farmers charity. I do feel that we need to be elevating farmers to be the most revered members of our society, because they not only grow the nutrient-dense foods that we need to be healthy, but they also nurture the soil for not just 60 more harvests, but for generation and generation and generation to come. So I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. Don't forget to go and leave a review on iTunes. You know, we want to get that number up, and we want to get this message out because it is such an important message. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.